Good morning, happy Friday. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda. President Trump says he will decide on possible Iran strikes within 2 weeks, opening the door to potential negotiations in the meantime. This as Israel attacks more Iranian nuclear sites. Brent crude tumbles and S&P futures pair losses as the US stays on the sidelines of the conflict, at least for now. Plus, Europe pushes the diplomatic route with EU's foreign minister set to meet Iran's top diplomat in Geneva later today. And at 6:30 a.m. UK time, we are launching Bloomberg Tech Europe in our first show. We're going to take a deep dive into the AI race and whether Europe can close the gap with the US and China. We'll put that question to our panel of guests. So a possible 2-week reprieve in terms of whether or not the US intervenes directly with Iran. That opens the door for negotiations. European stocks then are bid after losses of around 0.8 by the end of the close yesterday on the benchmark in Europe. You're now looking at futures pointing upside of a similar amount on the European stocks 50 futures, looking to add 40 points, pointing higher by 0.8%. Relief then across these markets as the US, at least for now, stays on the sidelines. FTSE 100 futures looking to add 24 points. US markets then reopening after that national holiday, of course, yesterday. Looking at losses of around 0.2%, but the losses have paired on the back of this news. NASDAQ 100 futures pointing down by a little under 0.2%. Let's flip the board and have a look cross-asset then. A lot of action from the central banks yesterday as well, of course, with cuts in Norway, cuts in Sweden, the Bank of England staying as expected on hold. 4.38 right now for the US 10-year, largely unchanged in the session today, again, as that liquidity and treasury market action comes back to the fore. It's triple witching as well today, just worth remembering in terms of some potential volatility and adjustments around volumes across the equity space. Euro dollar at 115, stronger on softer greenback, currently gaining 0.3% on the single currency. Brent, of course, remains in focus. The volatility has been there through this week, of course, on the conflict in the Middle East. $77 a barrel right now, dropping more than 2% on Brent. Gold also a little softer, down 0.5% as that haven bid starts to fade on the suggestion that maybe there is a bit of space for diplomacy when it comes to Israel, Iran and the US. Worth noting, of course, that the conflict between Israel and Iran itself continues. Let's cross over to Asia right now. Some really interesting data in terms of the price pressures building in Japan. Avril Hong standing by in Singapore. Avril.
Yeah, price pressures in Japan, certainly, but also think about the geopolitical backdrop. That's been really interesting for Asia stocks and the sense of resilience that you've seen them flashing this week. We had our MLive colleague, Garfield Reynolds, also highlighting that in times of uncertainties, it does seem like investors don't like these markets with stretched valuations, and valuations in Asia looking cheap, looking attractive. So maybe that preference among investors versus, say, these US stocks. You're seeing that green in stocks in the region. The outperformance today is coming from South Korea, and this is driven by AI chip-related stocks. There's also corporate governance reform optimism. Japan is looking flat. Let's flip the board and take a look at that data you speak of. We saw Japan inflation accelerating more than expected to the highest level in 2 years. What was interesting was how it came out and kind of coincided with the Bank of Japan's minutes for the meeting in the month of May, so not the one this week, and it sounded quite hawkish. Other things to keep an eye on include a finance ministry meeting with bond market participants that's coming later today, and they're going to be seeking thoughts on the reduction of issuance of long-end bonds to help to quell market turbulence. So a lot to keep an eye on when it comes to bonds in Japan. We're seeing futures there under pressure today. Flip the board again. I wanted to also highlight what we're seeing in the FX space. Obviously in Asia, they've been coming under pressure this week as well, given the Middle East tensions, the dollar softness that you speak of earlier because of Trump talking about this 2-week window is helping Asia FX snap a 3-session losing streak. Tom.
Avril Hong, excellent roundup of what we're seeing in Asia. Thank you very much indeed. To the geopolitics then in more focus right now, because Donald Trump has given himself 2 weeks then to decide whether or not to strike Iran. It is a week now since Israel began its attacks. Overnight, an inactive nuclear reactor near the town of Arak was hit. The US president is due to attend a National Security Council meeting later, while European and Iranian diplomats are to meet in Geneva. The White House press secretary said Trump wants to give diplomacy a chance.
I have a message directly from the president, and I quote, "Based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks."
OK, let's bring in Bloomberg's Germana Pesecci from the region. Germana, Trump then remaining undecided. We have a 2-week window, it seems. Hostilities, though, clearly continuing on the ground.
That's it. So the news obviously being that there's potentially a 2-week reprieve coming, with President Trump in that readout that the press secretary gave, saying that he will decide what to do within the next 2 weeks. And then later on, she adds, if there's a chance for diplomacy, the president is always going to grab it. Therefore, opening the window here to perhaps take advantage of some of the setbacks that the Iranian regime has faced over the course of the last 7 days to bring them back to the negotiating table. Several other outlets reporting that Steve Witkoff, the president's special advisor, has also had some direct conversation with the Iranian foreign minister Abbas Araghchi as well. That same foreign minister will be in Geneva meeting with his European counterparts. So all of that going on. But of course, the intensity of the strikes between Israel and Iran, even though it has lessened in the last 24 hours, the war of words has not. And this is namely because one very potent missile that Iran launched managed to penetrate Israel's air defense system yesterday, causing significant damage at a hospital, wounding over 240 people. On the back of that, the Israel Defense Minister, Israel Katz, is saying that the supreme leader should not continue to exist. So once again, threatening the life of the Ayatollah. Overnight, you were just talking about some of the nuclear reactors being hit again. But I should also say, Tom, that the information coming out of Iran has been hampered because there has been a blackout there. Internet traffic is down 90%, with the Iranian telecommunications telling their public that they should switch off using all social media, all apps, all forms of communication in case they get cyber attacked. So not a lot of information is coming from Iran at this point.
On the international nature of this conflict, Germana, interesting reporting from our team on Bloomberg on the decisions by Russia and China to give diplomatic cover to Iran, but not to supply them with any hardware, at least for now. What about the proxies? What about Iranian proxies and their potential role in this conflict?
And this, by the way, is a really valid question, because it's another reason why perhaps President Trump senses an opportunity to bring Iran to the table, to force them to accept more onerous terms, because the proxies have been relatively quiet. Hezbollah, obviously the largest non-state military actor in the region, and they've been severely diminished after that Israel-Hezbollah war towards the end of last year, I should say. Israeli military saying that they have eliminated about 70% of Hezbollah's arsenal. And you have a new government in Lebanon now, pro-West, pro-Arab states. They want to do the right thing. Hezbollah doesn't have the political clout it once had. The others, Houthis, even though close to Iran, are not necessarily a proxy of Iran. They fought in the name of the Palestinian cause. They're not necessarily inclined to pick up a fight on behalf of the Iranian regime. They too, remember, they also signed on to a truce with the US about a month ago. So that leaves you with Hamas, obviously a very different situation, because they're pretty much most of their capabilities have been diminished throughout the course of this 20-month war with Israel. And then finally, that leaves you with Kataib Hezbollah, that is an Iraqi Shia militia closely aligned to Iran. Nothing there, but they have warned overnight, and let me just read you the exact quote that came from one of their senior leaders there. American bases throughout the region will become akin to duck hunting grounds should the U.S. get militarily involved in the campaign against Iran. So maybe that is one area to watch. But for now, the proxies are not doing much.
OK, Bloomberg's Germana Pesecci, thank you. 1 week into this war between Israel and Iran. Iran's foreign minister, meanwhile, is due in Geneva for talks with European foreign ministers today. Let's get more with Bloomberg's Oliver Crook, who's been very much focused on the international angles to this story as well. Ollie, what can we expect in terms of the conversations between the Europeans and the foreign minister of Iran? Do the Europeans have any clout at this point to push diplomacy?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, the answer to that question, Tom, is no. They don't have a huge amount of clout diplomatically or even a kind of leverage over this conflict on either side of it. So it's going to be sort of very limited in what they could do. So the meeting that you have today is between the Iranian foreign minister taking place in Geneva, Switzerland, with the German foreign minister as well as the French and the United Kingdom. We also understand that Kaja Kallas, the EU High Representative, will also be there for those discussions. Those are the first in-talks negotiations you've had by that constellation of diplomats since the beginning of this war or of this bombing campaign. We should say they spoke on the phone on Monday, and that didn't yield a whole lot. What the aim of the meeting would be, Tom, is to try to establish a kind of framework that you could put into place for monitoring after there is some sort of a ceasefire, some sort of peace, in order to have a framework to say, listen, these are what the terms are for monitoring the Iranian nuclear program. These are going to be basically the unrestricted access, potentially also conversations about sort of diminishing ballistic missile stockpiles within Iran. That is what the Europeans would like to bring to the table, potentially to the Trump administration. What the Europeans have been saying since the beginning is de-escalate, de-escalate, de-escalate. By that same token, Tom, there has been very little criticism on the European side of the bombing campaign of Israel. They really are putting most of the burden on the Iranians. There has been that sort of tacit approval from the European side. But as we were just saying, Tom, there is very sort of limited amounts of diplomatic pressure and leverage that they can bring to bear on this conflict. So unfortunately for the Europeans, it appears this is going to be yet another conflict in another situation geopolitically where they're really playing the role of spectator rather than protagonist.
And Ollie, you mentioned the UK, and the Foreign Minister David Lammy was over in the US yesterday meeting with his counterpart Marco Rubio, of course, Secretary of State. How much of a gulf exists between the US and its European and UK allies over this point, or are they starting to align now?
Well, listen, I think that they're just trying to get the ear of the people closest to Donald Trump. This is where these sort of things manage to get any kind of influence from an international standpoint. Isn't really, it seems, so much of being able to have those conversations one-on-one with Donald Trump and bringing influence to bear. I think you see that the gulf is still pretty wide on some of the questions of Israel, particularly on the issue of Gaza, right, where you've had a number of European leaders and a number of European officials who have been trying to exert their pressure. You had 17 out of the 27 EU member states just last month wanting to back a proposal to review the EU-Israel Association Agreement. That's an economic pact between the European Union and the Israelis in order to bring some pressure to bear on Israel in terms of its conduct, in terms of humanitarian aid within Gaza. Again, this is something that the Americans are not really at all aligned with, and it shows the limits of basically European diplomacy, even when there is these sort of fissures between ideology. I think that you have to say, though, that on the European side, on the question of Iran, between the U.S. and the Europeans, there is much less daylight. There is much more agreement on how to proceed going forward.
OK, Bloomberg's Oliver Crook, thank you very much indeed. So we look ahead to that meeting in Geneva. And in the next hour, we're going to be doing a deep dive into all of this with Barbara Leaf, who was US Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs until January of this year. So that analysis worth listening to as well. Here's what else to think about today. 7 a.m. UK time, UK retail sales, so a gauge of the UK consumer, as recent data suggests that maybe things are a little bit more resilient than some had expected when it comes to the UK consumer. And at 10 a.m. UK time, Euro area consumer confidence staying on the consumer story. That detail will drop, that data at 10 a.m. And today it is triple witching as well, so in terms of volatility and volumes. We have a redhead crossing the terminal right now on SoftBank. SoftBank's Masayoshi Son pitching a $1 trillion Arizona AI hub to TSMC and to the Commerce Secretary Lutnick. That is the redhead crossing the terminal right now. It looks like he is looking for tax breaks to build what is being described as a Shenzhen-style manufacturing hub in the United States. The ambitions then of Masayoshi Son of SoftBank, again, being underscored with this pitch. We'll bring you more details, of course, through the show as we get them on SoftBank and this pitch around Arizona and $1 trillion of spending on AI. Coming up, oil slumps as fears of an imminent US attack on Iran ease. We're going to bring you more on the markets. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. It is 1 week, of course, since Israel's first strike on Iran, which triggered a spike in crude oil futures and swings across other assets. Let's bring in Markets Live executive editor Mark Cudmore then for a deep dive in terms of the market moves with a particular lens on oil to kick things off. And then we'll move on to central banks. Mark, I'm looking at oil prices lower, obviously, on Brent at least for now, down to 2%. The risk premium has been priced into oil around this conflict. Trump's staying on the sidelines at least for now. What kind of stands out to you in terms of the moves that we've seen in these oil markets on the geopolitics?
So we're off a couple of dollars, as you say, on WTI, but we're still up about 20% from where we were trading just over a week ago. So that's quite a sizable move. What's interesting is that a 20% move in the most important commodity in the world, you'd think would have a much bigger macro impact. But in reality, most markets around the world are taking this largely in their stride. We've seen very calm markets mostly through June. And I think this is people are seeing that while this oil price has suddenly jumped by 20%, it's probably not sustainable up here because the bigger backdrop is that there's endless amount of supply that's just waiting on the sidelines to come in, not just from OPEC, but even from the US shale drillers, that if we get higher prices, they'll be more inclined to increase their drilling again. So people kind of feel that, yes, we might see sustained prices for some period of time, given that the conflict doesn't look like it's going to end quickly, but it's not likely it's going to keep on surging much higher, and the underlying pressures for oil prices to drift back lower over time.
Do you think that's been factored in by the central banks as well then, Mark? Because we saw those cuts coming through from European central banks yesterday. The BOE, of course, staying on hold as expected. Kind of tie that into what we're seeing on the central bank front. Tariffs clearly also something that they continue to weigh up.
Yeah, I think the central bank's in a very hard spot right now because not only do we have a large amount of uncertainty around the Middle East, but we obviously have extreme uncertainty around the trade situation with the US and, of course, that massive tax bill. And I know that tax bill is a US domestic story, but we saw in 2018 that if you're going to get a really large fiscal stimulus like this into a market like this that is not collapsing on growth, then that's going to see a surge in risk assets around the world, and that's going to have a global inflationary impact. So I think it's a very tough time for central banks at the moment. I actually think it makes complete sense, those central banks that are being a little bit more cautious. They can, like the Fed, for example, on the sidelines at high levels of rates, or supposedly high levels of rates, they can always be much more aggressive later on. It makes sense for a central bank as general policy to hold the line late and then act aggressively once they know which way to act. So I think it makes sense those in the sidelines. I know some central banks have been in a cutting cycle in Europe because of slow growth, because of that concern. But I think that overall, I am still quite worried about the inflationary impact of tariffs around the world over the coming 6 months.
And that was something clearly articulated, wasn't it, by Jay Powell earlier in the week. Look, Mark, you were talking to me during the break and saying, look, essentially in the last month, equity markets haven't really gone very far in either direction. What do you think is the next catalyst then for global equities?
It's definitely trade. It's amazing this month. We've actually seen very little movement outside oil markets. There's been some idiosyncratic stories in Asia. For example, the political unrest in Thailand and Korean stocks are trading well. But it's not just equity markets. FX markets have done very little. Bond markets have done very little. So generally, markets in June have been relatively steady after an extremely volatile year and some large moves and some trending moves, which just shows that the world is kind of waiting for two big catalysts. The much bigger one is what happens on trade. That July 9th arbitrary deadline is coming up. Does it just get rolled? Do lower levels come in? Do we get any deals announced at any point? So that's the biggest catalyst. But as I said, I think that the fiscal deal does matter globally. Not just because it matters for the largest consumer or largest economy in the world, consumer market in the world, but also because US stock market is still close to 50% of global market cap. So if we get that fiscal deal, that'll make a big impact as well.
OK, Mark Cudmore, Markets Live strategist from Singapore, with a check, of course, and the analysis around these markets, what to be looking out for in the weeks ahead. Mark, thank you. Now, the EU Economy Commissioner says the bloc is making progress in trade talks with the US. Valdis Dombrovskis says the European Union is continuing intensive talks ahead of a July the 9th tariff deadline set by President Donald Trump. Dombrovskis warned, though, that the EU remains ready to take measures to protect its economic interests and businesses. Coming up, Rheinmetall replaces Kering in the Euro Stoxx 50 today. It is a story of Europe's resurgent defence sector and struggles in the luxury space. We bring you that story next. This is Bloomberg. German defence firm Rheinmetall is set to replace Gucci owner Kering in the Euro Stoxx 50 benchmark today. Charlie Wells is here to talk us through the change. It's pretty dramatic in terms of the switch up, and it is a signal, a reminder of some pretty dramatic shifts underway in Europe more broadly, not just about these two individual companies.
That's right. I mean, those index rules for the Euro Stoxx 50 are tough. And basically, this is a story of a surge and of a plunge. So we get that surge from Rheinmetall up some 1,800% since 2022 on the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Say 1,800%.
1,800%. And then we've got Kering, representative of this kind of luxury slowdown. They went to their lowest position in April since 2016. So tough times, and this replacement really speaks to kind of broader change in the European economy.
I mean, honestly, given the security situation, isn't it better that we're focused on building tanks rather than luxury handbags? What does it tell us about the European economy?
So I think there is that sort of, pivot towards defense and away from these sort of consumer companies. But I think when you dig in, there's also a really interesting tell here about deglobalization. And we know that a lot of Kering's earnings come from Gucci, about 40%. And one of Gucci's most important markets is China. And so the consumer there is slowing down. There is some trade issues there, of course. But we also have this kind of reshoring issue, right? So we have a lot of European governments wanting to procure defense tanks, defense munitions, not from American companies, but from European companies. And so we're getting this trend of kind of deglobalization and reshoring playing out, and this is evidence of that.
On the luxury piece then, Kering, does it ever make its way back to the Stoxx 50? What is the turnaround story for Kering?
They would have to have a significant uptrend in the stock market. And then there's the flip of that, right? So when you are included in an index like this, as Rheinmetall is, you get this momentum, right? So there's increased analyst coverage, but also there is this issue of passive index funds, right? So because a stock is included in this index, funds that track that index are going to have to purchase that stock. So it creates something of a snowball effect here.
OK, yeah, the passive flows are significant, aren't they, when you are listed on the Stoxx 50. Charlie Wells, thank you very much indeed on the divergence between defence and luxury. Meanwhile, a SpaceX Starship rocket has exploded on a test stand in Texas, causing a massive blast and plumes of flames and smoke. The rocket appeared to be undergoing a routine ground-based engine test. The company says initial analysis points to the potential failure of a pressurized nitrogen tank in its nose cone. Coming up, is Europe moving fast enough on AI, or has the race with the US and China already been lost? We will take a deep dive into that topic in the very first episode of Bloomberg Tech Europe. That's up next. This is Bloomberg.